Now, last week we were also talking a lot about SpaceX because we went down to the launch of the Falcon Heavy, which I will put down below in the master playlist in case you missed it. And Commodore 256 wrote into that saying, ever notice once Elon Musk was allowed to make SpaceX, space travel got a lot cheaper. And it has gotten a lot cheaper very quickly. And it was the result of how NASA has changed how they are going about contracts for launching people and things into space. And about 8 years ago now, my gosh, time really flies, I co-wrote an article about the emergence of the commercial space industry because 8 years ago was around the time that the last space shuttle took off, and we did some pretty extensive coverage down there for CT Tech Junkie, which is a site that I write for occasionally here in Connecticut. And it was really fascinating to see this transition at work because the public was thinking the space shuttle's going away, there is nothing happening. But in fact, there had been a multi-year effort to transition NASA's launch services away from government-run programs to commercially managed programs. And it's actually a very innovative funding model. Check out the article because it's still very relevant now. And it's actually fun to read now that SpaceX has found a lot of success in this industry because a lot of folks were not thinking they were going to be able to achieve all the things that they were talking about. But they have been able to accomplish most of them that we talked about here in the article. Because when this article was written, they hadn't yet delivered anything to the space station. They had just finished their first orbital flight, but they were collecting a lot of contracts to do more work. They got a number of commercial satellite providers on board, which was very unusual for an American rocket company to get. And they also got a very large NASA contract for sending cargo up to the space station. Now, if you want to read more about this, you can go on to two links that I'm going to put up on screen. The first is for their commercial resupply business, which are cargo flights. And right now, the two contractors that NASA has selected for that and are currently operating are Northrop Grumman, who owns Orbital ATK, and SpaceX. And in fact, just a couple of days ago, Orbital ATK sent up a resupply mission to the station. They actually launched those rockets out of Virginia, not Florida. And some nights I can actually see the rockets from here in Connecticut, which is awesome. I'll do a live stream when we have a good opportunity to see one of those happen. Now, the orbital rocket is not reusable. So the rocket gets discarded in the ocean, and then the supply vehicle, which gets docked to the station, is loaded up with garbage and then also sent into the ocean as well. SpaceX, of course, uses their Dragon spacecraft, which is reusable and can re-enter the atmosphere and be recovered. So they have replicated a lot of what the shuttle was doing insofar as cargo is concerned. And the big difference between how the commercial services work versus how things used to work is that these are fixed contracts. The company that launches the rocket works out a price and they have to stick to that price. The way these things worked before was that the company providing the spaceship, whether it's the space shuttle or the Saturn V rocket or any of the other things that NASA had used in the past, that company would be guaranteed a profit. They were working on a cost-plus contract, meaning that whatever the cost was, the company would get X amount of dollars above the cost as profit. The way this works is that it is fixed rate, and therefore, being the low bidder has some real advantages. And if you can bring down your costs, you can be more competitive, which is why SpaceX from the get-go has been focused on reusability. The more they can reuse, the cheaper it is to launch it again. And if you're discarding rockets in the ocean every time, that's not very efficient. And that is why SpaceX has been so aggressive in bringing down costs, because their biggest customer is NASA, and they need to be able to be competitive, especially now that there are other startups now trying to do similar things, namely the company that Jeff Bezos started called Blue Origin. They're also working with reusable rockets in hopes to be able to get this commercial resupply business. Now, what happened here, though, is that NASA provided a lot of money to these companies to develop the spacecraft that they are sending up, but they did them on specific milestones. So they selected a number of companies and had them compete for achieving these milestones as quickly and as safely as they could. And then if they got to that point, they would knock out the people that were not succeeding in meeting those milestones, and then they would provide another round of funding to help them continue to develop their systems from there. So a lot of what SpaceX has been able to achieve came from this government funding. They did have a lot of private funding to get them to a point where they would be eligible, But a lot of what you see SpaceX doing here is a result of some of the NASA dollars that came in through this commercial program. There was another program for actually developing the commercial vehicles, which was separate from this, but you get the idea as to how all this works. Fixed rate contracts, no more cost plus, and that is why SpaceX is doing better than Boeing and some of the incumbents are, because they have built their business models around cost plus, not around fixed rate contracts. And I think that's going to be something that Boeing is going to have to adapt quickly to. Now, there is another program called Commercial Crew, and I'll put a link to this down below in the video description because I put the wrong link on screen here. And this program is similar to the cargo program, but it involves developing spacecraft to bring astronauts up to the space station from American soil once again, because the U.S. has been basically buying seats on the Russian Soyuz for a good amount of time. This program is going slower than the cargo program is, primarily because there is a lot more at stake here, namely the lives of the crew members that are going up in these devices. And for this service, Boeing and SpaceX are the two lead contractors that will be providing this. Boeing has a small space capsule, and SpaceX, of course, has their Crew Dragon. And SpaceX was on track to really be ahead in this because they did successfully dock an unmanned Crew Dragon with the space station a couple of months ago. They brought it safely back to Earth and recovered it. And they were hoping next month to do a crew escape test where they were actually going to launch the capsule, detach it from the rocket while the rocket was still mid-flight, blow up the rocket, and then bring the capsule back to the ground safely to simulate a launch abort. And unfortunately, SpaceX had a pretty big setback over the weekend. This is a video that appeared on Twitter from a guy named Astronaut99, and it appears to be an accurate depiction of what occurred. They were testing out the escape rockets on that capsule when it looks like one of the pressure tanks failed on it and the capsule exploded. This was the same capsule that went to the space station, so it is now apparently lost. And one of the things that you don't get from this new space program is a lot of transparency. Because these are private companies, there are competitive considerations here. NASA is not broadcasting a lot of these tests as they happen. You see the launches, but you don't see a lot of the other things that go into the processing of the spacecraft here, because there are confidential industry secrets now versus something that the government owns and operates. And for example, this video here was unauthorized. Somebody recorded it, looks like from a screen somewhere, and leaked it out. But typically SpaceX doesn't release these things for competitive reasons. Now, NASA is still developing a government-owned and operated rocket called the Space Launch System. It consists of this huge rocket, which is going to be the most powerful rocket ever created, along with a spacecraft at the top called the Orion. And this will be designed for deep space missions. And deep space means going beyond Earth orbit. And that means that the spacecraft has to support astronauts for a much longer period of time. It also enters the Earth's atmosphere again when it comes back at a much higher velocity than the two crewed commercial spacecraft we just talked about. So it's a very different program for a very different mission. Now, this program began under the George W. Bush administration under a different name called Constellation. And this was to be a space shuttle replacement, both for low Earth orbit work, but also deep space work involving going to the moon and then to an asteroid and then on to Mars. And it was kind of a neat idea, too, because I think one of the things they were looking to do was actually land on one of the Martian moons first, develop a presence there, and then move on to the ground mission on Mars itself. When the Obama administration took over and the commercial stuff was moving at a brisker pace, they nixed some of what the Constellation plan was and scaled it back. And the Obama administration wanted to set an asteroid as their goal versus going back to the moon. And now the Trump administration wants to go back to the moon and set up a permanent base there of some kind and then move out from there. So there's been a lot of different ideas from different administrations as this rocket has been developing. And when you've got a specialized spacecraft like this, you kind of need to know where you're aiming it at. And unfortunately, I think all of these different plans have complicated the development of this program to the point where the costs have become enormous, and we still don't have anything to even test, let alone go to the moon with. So hopefully things will develop. The one thing that has happened over the last couple of years is a successful test of the Orion spacecraft what they did do is they launched it on a Delta Heavy rocket and then had it come back to Earth at around the same rate of speed it would come back from the moon, and it was successful in doing that. So that's some progress there, but the rocket itself that they want to put it on is not yet out there, and that's led to some controversy and some debate as to whether or not it might be cheaper to send up components of this mission on reusable commercial rockets for a lower price, but maybe over a shortly longer period of time than it might cost to launch a single large rocket like this one. And I think that's going to be the pressure that a lot of these commercial companies are going to be putting on NASA and Congress as we are definitely going back to the moon and going beyond it. The question is, how are we getting there? And I think that's going to be the big topic of discussion over the next several years.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold-level supporters, the Four Guys with Quarters podcast, Tom Albrecht, and Kalyan Kumar. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to lon.tv/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit lon.tv/s.